Hi, Femi. Thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us about a very important topic, affirmative action, that has been in the news a lot. Lots of people are talking about it and have strong opinions, but I find that many times people don't exactly know what it means. So I'd like for you to start us off by actually describing in your own words what is affirmative action, and then saying a little bit about why you think this is important.
Yes, thank you, Keisha. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today. I think when I think about affirmative action, specifically to the work in undergraduate admissions, it really has everything to do with the factors that we are able to consider when evaluating candidates for admission. And so for us, that means as folks who are looking at a variety of pieces of information, we're looking at academic factors, socio and economic factors. We are also looking at demographic indicators, and affirmative action allows us the opportunity to consider things like race in the evaluation process when making admissions decisions. It's something that gives you license to consider race when any institution is kind of thinking about how they want to craft their class of incoming scholars every year.
Thanks. And can you talk a little bit about how race shapes some of those factors that also are considered for admission? So, what's the relationship between race and educational opportunity? And do students of color in the US have the same kinds of educational opportunities that we may think of as students who are white and doing their application?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question because I think what you're asking is how is the K through 12 experience uh, operationalized along identity markers like race, and I think it's a really important question. And the research and the data are out there both at a national level, but also at a state level around the experiences of race. And so, for example, when we take a look at different metrics such as the ability to access AP courses or AP coursework. The fact of the matter is that there are still significant gaps in AP participation by race, and we know that even though AP courses as a whole have broadened their access, the gap of who's participating in AP still persists between Black and Brown students and their white and Asian counterparts. I bring up APs because APs are a sign of rigor that is considered in admissions processes, and having AP is a sign of college readiness. But again, that's a signal that only comes from uh, privileged groups and not the whole. And so that's one way that I would take a look at that. I would also take a look at the percentage of Black and Brown students that are in low SES, low socioeconomic high schools versus their white counterparts as well. And the percentages of Black and Brown students there is significantly higher. And so when we think about what those resources, what those academic environments bring, um, oftentimes worse student to teacher ratios, worse student to faculty or student to counselor ratios when it comes to the college counseling component for Black and Brown students. And so it's a significant issue that you have to ameliorate when you're creating your evaluation processes in order for them to truly be equitable. And then I would say the last thing is the access to extracurricular activities that exist in well-resourced high schools versus bigger public schools or schools with less resources. Again, the gap in that is significant, and the types of experiences, whether those are math Olympiads, debate clubs, robotics is a really great example where you see robotics in K through 12 versus where you don't is often delineated by socioeconomic status and therefore has a disparate impact on race there. And so those are some of the indicators in which race does actually cut across the lines of K through 12 experiences. What I'll also say in a state like California where we cannot consider race and gender, I think it's important to know that specifically for Black students, the ability to really find those pockets of Black students isn't what I think a lot of people think that it is truly there. The proxy is not there. Black does not mean low income anymore. Black does not mean first generation anymore either. And while there are still significant numbers of Black and Brown students that are first generation, many are not, right? Many might have had first generation parents, but now that they're in our applicant pools now, that's not the case. And so I think that that's important. Even in the high schools in which uh, we are seeing AP availability and diverse student bodies, the conversation around tracking also draws around racial lines. And tracking really, tracking is when you take a look at the high ability classrooms, such as APs and honors courses, and those sequences of courses in a high school versus lower ability classes in the math and the sciences. And what you'll find is that in the highly tracked spaces or in the more academically or college readiness types of spaces, the Black and Brown students, even at high schools that offer those curriculum, are not participating in those curriculum at the same level as their white and their Asian peers. And so that is really how I think the racialized experiences of K through 12 manifest. There's countless other ways that I'm not mentioning, but those are some of the ones that really come to the top of my mind when I'm thinking about the impact that race has on a student's K through 12 experience.
Thank you for that full answer. And those are really big, important ways in which race shows up in shaping the experiences. And so, what I think you've done a great job of helping us to see is how colleges may think, okay, this is who our ideal student is and what indicates that a student is ready, and how the ability of students to kind of show up and have those indicators is shaped by race. And so you kind of started towards the end talking about what happens when we can and cannot take race into account, because race is shaping these K through 12 experiences. And in California, places like Berkeley are not able, public institutions are not able to take race into account when they are putting together their class, and schools that are private, like Stanford, are able to do that. And so can you talk a little bit about the difference that makes in terms of the kind of classes that these two very prestigious, important, rigorous institutions are able to create?
No, I appreciate the question, and I'll be honest. So just a little bit about myself, right? So before I was here at Berkeley, I did spend some time at Stanford University doing diversity work in their undergraduate admissions office, and before that, I was at Cornell University's College of Engineering and University of Delaware and Ithaca College before that. And so I've been doing this work at a variety of different types of institutions in different states. When I came to California, I came working at Stanford. And so it wasn't until I was actually interviewing for the Berkeley role that I even understood and knew what Prop 209 was, because it was not a factor for the private schools in the state of California. And so in both instances, both Stanford and in and here at Berkeley, the things that we discuss around what it means to be a highly selective but equitable admissions office is making sure that we are looking at the context in which students are coming from, right? And so understanding high school environments, understanding what excellence in a local context truly looks like. So that way we're not comparing students to experiences that they never had the opportunity to participate in was really, really important. And we would do that in a variety of ways. And so I say all of that to say that whether you are considering race or not, it's kind of similar to the SAT before, whether you're considering the SAT or not, that is not what makes your process equitable, right? Those signals don't necessarily determine whether you're being equitable in your evaluation process. We considered standardized testing at Stanford when I was there, And I thought we did that in an equitable manner. We got rid of standardized testing when I got to the UC, and I think that we are absolutely considering our students in an equitable manner. And I say that simply to say that signals are not systems, right? And so just because an institution might have a new rule or a new stance does not mean that they are truly equitable in their evaluation. What I've learned since coming to Berkeley has really just been around how important it is to dig into localized context, how much more important that is in this race neutral space and opportunity. And that required challenging some notions around our work and really kind of taking a three-pronged approach around centering our work around equity and diversity and inclusion, right? So the first approach had everything to do with our outreach strategy, where we go, why we go, what we say when we get there, and how is that reflective of our values of equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? And so taking a look at where are people across our state, not just we have a tradition in our practice in the admissions field around feeder schools, right? And a feeder school is a school that sends you an enormous amount of applications, and in many instances, you will go back and make sure that you visit that school to ensure that you're kind of keeping that pipeline going. But when you're as selective as both Stanford and Berkeley, one of the things that I always challenged was we need to go to places where people don't know who we are, right? We need to go and find those pockets in those communities that don't know who we are, and really encourage those students to apply. So that was one of the things that I did when we got to Berkeley, and that was really, really important. And as we stepped into some of those communities, we were met with some skepticism. Don't get me wrong, right? And I tell my staff, and I tell the counselors that might meet us with that skepticism, that the skepticism that we've earned in those communities, or the skepticism that we're receiving in those communities, is something that we earned, and we earn that over time. And the only way that we'll be able to compete or combat that is with consistency. And so consistently showing up and being there and engaging with counselors and gatekeepers and parents, because we know that the college going conversation is still a dinner table conversation. The second part was also making sure that we really took a look at our evaluation process. And when we talk about looking for excellence, again, making sure that our version of excellence is not steeped in an experience that is not common. And I think, my greatest fear in our profession is that a lot of times when we talk about academic excellence, we talk about what we desire versus what is available. And there's a huge misstep in doing that when it comes to understanding what's actually out there in our applicant pools. And so we made a lot of changes in our application evaluation process, much more training around bias and stereotypes, and again, training and excellence in the local context to be able to better understand what's happening in these high schools. That was particularly helpful through the COVID experience, right? And understanding how did high schools adapt and adjust through COVID. And so having that specific localized knowledge was helpful. And then the third was in our yield phase, right? When it comes to us actually working to yield these students, recognizing that, the students that we admit and that we are bringing onto campus, they likely got admitted to many other fine institutions. And so rather than saying, hey, you're lucky to be here, we tell students we are absolutely lucky if you choose us, because we recognize that these students have options. And I think that students are no longer kind of just sitting on their laurels and saying, oh, I got into this school, so I'm going to go. They're very much asking, what is this school going to do for me? And I think that that means that we need to put our best foot forward and showcasing our community, and really doing what we can to roll out the red carpet for the students that we admit, so they know that we're serious about our commitment to them from the moment that they step onto our campus.
Wow, thank you for that. I love the phrase of, signals are not systems. And you did a great job of laying out what are the things that we can do through the admissions process to build a more robust, diverse, highly qualified student body, even when you cannot take race into account itself as part of the admissions process. So thank you for laying out some of the tools that you use to build a talented and diverse incoming class. And with that, I want to ask you, I know you weren't here before when Prop 209 was not in existence, but, to the extent that you could comment on the similarities and differences in the classes that you're able to build now and before, is there still a gap in the kind of racial diversity or the makeup of those classes, even with the kind of extensive transformation and localized assessments that you're doing currently?
Yes, I really appreciate that question because it allows me to say that I am incredibly proud of the work that we have done in regards to diversifying this institution with incredibly strong and bright scholars from a variety of walks of life. That is, since I started my time here at Berkeley, I've been a big advocate for people to understand that diversity and excellence and academic excellence are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, you cannot have one without the other. And we've proved that through our classes every year that I've been here. We've had classes that are more diverse than every other year before I got here, since Prop 209. And so all I want to say four of our classes now have been some of the most diverse classes that we've seen since Prop 209. And while that is something that I'm incredibly proud of, um, those numbers are impressive because of where we're coming from and not where we're supposed to be. I think that when I really think about the state of California and how diverse the state is, and we're a public flagship, we should be reflective of the state, right? And we should look like the citizens that we were built to serve. And so I'm incredibly proud that we've continued to make that work move, but we have not fully recovered from our pre-Prop 209 numbers, especially around the Black community in particular. And so I do think that there's still much work to be done. The last thing that we're doing is resting on our laurels over here. But I think that we have created the formula, if you will, in regards to engagement and outreach and research and localized partnerships, that it's going to be a matter of consistency, I think, in those that is going to allow us to reach all of the big kind of enrollment goals that we have. I'll also say that something that cannot be understated, specifically when we're talking about the communities of color or wanting to engage rural students or low SES students, um, is the impact of COVID. We have to recognize that COVID did not just happen to the juniors and the seniors that were approaching the college admissions process. COVID happened to people in middle school, people in elementary school. And if you think about the grades in which students are supposed to be really picking up on their reading in first grade, for example, or the years in which students are supposed to be really understanding the foundations of mathematics, there were some students that went home with iPads and other students that went home with a workbook. And the students that went home with a workbook are going to come back to schools that are under resourced, right? So when we talk about what these students are going to look like in 8 or 9 years when they're approaching our application process, it's important, again, that we understand what's happening within the local context. Because if we hold students to a bar that was already a leap for them to make, given where they were coming from, and is now a mountain that they would need to climb in order to get over, we have to ask ourselves, is our process truly equitable? And I would say that the answer to that, unless you are considering really understanding those localized contexts, the answer to that is no. Now, there's two ways that we can address that, right? One way is taking a look at our admissions requirements and our admissions experiences and what are the things that we value, right? And how do we make sure that that is reflected in there while also being attentive to the the ways in which K through 12 is evolving and changing. The second is also institutions taking a very close look at their first year curriculums and your entry level curriculums and asking yourself, these are entry level for who? And when you ask yourself that, you can start to understand if you are making, if your entry level curriculum is couched in a K through 12 experience of readiness that was not available to most people, that has to be adjusted, right? And so even here on our campus, those are some of the conversations that we're beginning to just have around what does it mean, again, for us to serve students based off of what's been available to them and what they've experienced. And so that is some of the work that continues to be done, and that I think that we need to continue to pay attention to.
That is so helpful and insightful around, the kind of intensity of localized understanding and contextual understanding of student experiences, and how it's not just this moment in time, but projecting forward and thinking about, 8 years from now, 10 years from now. We need to understand how those schools were able to respond to students in COVID, and then what does it mean in terms of how we can ensure that we have an equitable opportunity for students in our states to be able to learn here. It was really insightful. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to follow up on where you were ending, which is your second strategy of looking at our first year experience. And so, we've been talking before now a lot about admissions and how do we design an admission process that acknowledges the role in which opportunities K through 12 are organized through race, and how can we account for that with or without a race conscious admission. But once students are admitted, they still now have to finish 4 years. And so, what are the barriers that students of color face having been admitted, to Berkeley or Stanford or any of these other predominantly white institutions once they're on campus? From your experience, what are some of the barriers that have been identified by students? And more importantly, what are some of the things that educators, administrators, and the broader educational institutions could do to support them and mitigate those issues?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I appreciate about COVID that was also just kind of happening with the generation of scholars that are coming in is a much more astute acknowledgement of mental health and neurodivergence, right? People knowing that I learn differently, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's there's uh, there's actually a lot more commonality around that than people realize. To me, I think to respond to that as something that I'm seeing just in the applications, right? Students are much more open in talking about, again, either their mental health issues or the different ways in which they learn. I think it's going to really challenge a lot of our institutions to think about some of the traditional ways in which we have delivered education, and perhaps a need for us to rethink and remodel what that looks like. you know, the COVID experience thrusted us into online learning. And for some faculty, it was a great opportunity to try new things. For other faculty, it was such a divergence from what they were used to, that it was a bit of a challenge. And while that was a forced experiment because of the time that it happened, I think it's important that as we come back into the in-person experience, that we don't abandon the lessons that we might have learned through digital learning and teaching. And I know that one of the things that we are doing here on our campus is really taking a look at which classes are we able to teach online, to be able to help us with things like class impaction, right? And students not having the ability to take a class because there's a long wait list for it. Well, if we can teach the class online, now we can broaden the scope of the amount of students that can participate in that class. The other thing that I think is important for us to take a look at is things like our summer bridge and our summer bridge and kind of those on-ramping experiences. We know specifically for Black and Brown students that first year and first semester in particular are major when it comes to creating academic identities and scholarly ethos within those students. And at institutions like mine, and I tell students this at orientation, that it does not matter if you came from the best private school in the country. It does not matter if you were the valedictorian of your class. When you get to our campus, our first year curriculum is no joke, right? It is something that is rigorous for everyone, right? And so if that's been the case, even with the most prepared, us really taking a look at some of our summer bridge experiences and asking ourselves, is the summer enough, right? Like, is the summer enough, or do we need to think about longer on-ramp types of experiences that might go through the first semester to ensure that students have what they need to be able to engage in the curriculum in a way that's affirming for them, both through their success, but also affirming to the faculty members that are going to be working with them and teaching them, right? And so really just even paying attention to those first couple of years, I think are going to, that first year transition, onto a campus, I think is going to be critical and crucial for many of us. Because again, my greatest fear, right, is as institutions are diversifying, because the diversity trends that we're seeing at Berkeley, we're catching up to what we're seeing across the rest of the country, right? Most institutions, most privates, most Ivies have been actively diversifying over the last couple of years, and that I think is really, really great. However, as the institutions are diversifying, as the conversation around the SAT is becoming more and more complex about whether you need it or not, the interaction with the COVID experience, my fear is that there will be some sort of conversation that says, if, let me say this. My fear is that when students show up on our campuses, um, they will be judged by a standard that is outdated and does not make sense given their academic experiences in K through 12. And so, and I say that in a variety of ways. When you look at a student who graduated from high school during the pandemic with a 4.0, for example, half of that 4.0 was pass fail, right? If half of that 4.0 was pass fail, that student walking around with a 4.0 is literally not the same as the student that was walking around from that same high school with a 4.0 6 or 7 years ago, right? That's not a fault on the student, right? I'm not faulting the student for that, but it's an acknowledgement that we have to understand and then decide if we need to change or adjust any of our teaching methods around that, right? And so it's important that we don't paint that student as not being college ready. It's important that we recognize that the readiness conversation really needs to be on the colleges to determine whether or not they are student ready, because every student across the country is going through what we are talking about. And I think it's really important for the colleges to be reflexive of that experience. Not every college needs to do that. I recognize that, right? Not every institution is going to be required to think about that, but most are. And I think public flagships should, which is why I've been pushing that conversation here on our campus as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful to hear and to think about how it's the responsibility of the institution. Again, to your point of it's a system, not the kind of individual, and how important the theme that I keep hearing you talk about is localized contextual knowledge of the student's experience, and that comes throughout the whole, not just admissions process, but as you said, the onboarding and kind of shaping their first semester experience and beyond. And so that you've given us a really helpful picture of that whole kind of academic transition and what could be done to support students in that academic transition. Could you talk a little bit about co-curricular or any of the non-instructional pieces and how that factors into student success and how we can create an experience where all students who are admitted, we know are qualified and can thrive, but how do we create an environment where they actually do thrive at these predominantly white institutions?
Yeah, I know that's a really important question, and I think that what's constantly overlooked was, and again, I keep going back to COVID just because it is the game changer, I think, right now in the entire educational landscape. It's one of the only things that touches K-12, higher ed, elementary school, the whole nine. And while a lot of people have focused on the learning loss pieces and the academic pieces, the 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 social and emotional learning that takes place in both middle school and high school is significant. And when we came back to campus, a lot of institutions across the country talked about the rise in conflicts in the residence halls, the rise in conflicts amongst their student bodies. And I think it's important that when we think about creating affirming spaces, really diving into what that truly means. One of the things that we have been focused on our campus for example, is our African American initiative. And our African American initiative has been one that has been growing over time. And a big part of that has been creating co-curricular social emotional spaces for students, right? And so the first was that we created a Fannie Lou Hamer Black Resource Center, a cultural hub for students to be able to find themselves and to find not just themselves, but other faculty and staff who stop by the Fannie Lou Hamer Center just to have a place of community on campus. We also have our Afro floor. It's a living and learning community. And that Afro floor started off as a single floor and then expanded to multiple floors. And again, if you ask our students, that Afro floor is a haven for many of our students to be able to go back to after kind of experiencing the PWI out there in the world all day. You can come back to the Afro floor and see a community that is like you. And that's that experience, that desire for that community. That's not specific to African Americans. That's not specific to Black students, right? Many of the best practices around creating spaces is creating multiple spaces for students. I would also say what's really important for us to not forget either is that the fastest growing population in higher education right now is multiracial students. And oftentimes for the first time in their lives, when students are applying to college, that's when they actually have to check a box of what race are you. So we should really make sure that, again, as that community is growing, that we are not forcing students into boxes that they don't want to be forced into. And I think that is really, really important. Many colleges have started to have that conversation when we start to think about things like gender or sexual orientation, but we need to make sure that we are mindful about that when it comes to race as well. And I think that the institutions that are better at doing that are seeing more inclusive communities. I'll also just say that inclusion is not a synonym for happiness. That's not what it is. And I think that a lot of times people believe if we have an inclusive community, then there will be no issues. But I actually think it's the opposite. An inclusive community means that everybody has an opportunity to say what they want at the table. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to like what everyone says. And I think that that's really important, especially when you think about how polarized our world is or our country is right now. That college is the place where people are supposed to be able to practice what it means to engage with people with ideas and ideals that are not like theirs. And if we can showcase what it means to have and hold those communities where people can mutually disagree and still have respect for each other, the need for that grows so much on our college campuses as we're moving to a more diverse and more just a more diverse economy and more diverse democracy. And so to me, making those spaces is critical again for our students. And I talk about this from kind of an admissions and an enrollment space around both supporting students academically, emotionally, and culturally, because it's important to me that diversity is one goal and inclusion and belonging is another. And while you can't get belonging and inclusion without diversity, I want to make sure that all of the fruit that we are harvesting in admissions isn't dying on the vine when the students get to our campuses, and that they are actually being served, not just to survive on our campuses, but to thrive when they get there.
Yes, well said. And yeah, it really is. I appreciated your point about the importance of engagement and that it's not just about having the numbers here, but actually having people engaged in learning the skills of what it takes to live in a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, right? Like that is a state of being. And if we can create the kinds of diverse communities that you do such a good job of working to build, and then we can create the kind of environments that allow them to thrive when they are here, then what we get is exactly the kind of education and American society, future citizenship, that reflects the best of who we say we are, or at least want to be. So,
And if I could just add
please.
a big piece of that, I think is ensuring that even at predominantly white institutions, that your faculty are diverse, and that is something that I'm really proud that we've been doing. We've been doing some really great jobs of diversifying our faculty and our deans on this campus in ways that I think are really, really important. And it's not just having racial diversity, but it's having racial diversity spread across disciplines, right? And so making sure that you are seeing Black and Brown people in the hard sciences, making sure that you're seeing Latinx folks in the social sciences and the humanities, right? Making sure that we're seeing, and also faculty being very open about the fact that they are first generation. I think that I know that when I was a student, I used to think that the teacher slept at school, right? Like that's just what I thought. But getting to understand that these faculty have had their own academic journeys, their own personal journeys, I think is really important. And I think it's more salient now for our students than ever before. Our students that are coming in are the types of students that they want to know that you care before they care what you know. And I think that by our faculty really showing our students who they have been able to create greater connections with our students. Now, I say that to say, don't get me wrong, we absolutely still have issues in the classroom sometimes, right? We absolutely still have chilly environments sometimes for our students of color, and it's definitely something that we are continuing to work on. But the fact that we have even recognized that faculty representation is important is a shift in the mental model of what it means to serve students. And so I think that that is something that I'm continuing to be proud of. And I think that, again, all of our institutions really need to think about how are we diversifying our faculty to also reflect the types of the student body diversity that you're aiming to see, because students are paying attention.